Hello everyone, can you hear me? Figured I'd get jumping in here a little bit early, that way if anyone else wants to trickle in before we started, we'll have everyone here for when the live stream actually starts in just a couple minutes. Hey Eddie, how you doing? It's nice seeing everybody here already. This is quite a bit different than the last live stream I did many months ago, with only a few people. Welcome everyone that's joining. So if you guys don't know, in this video what we're going to do is a code review of the very first series that I ever did on YouTube, which was like my introduction to web development series, where we covered HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'm going to be covering all of those different topics and show what I would have changed from that series, because since that series was kind of aimed at beginners, there's a lot of things that I would do differently and things that just looking back, I'm like, I don't know why I even did it that way. So it's going to be a lot of fun to just kind of dig through that older code and figure out what would I change, knowing what I know now and knowing that it's not teaching toward, very beginners. I have a more advanced audience I can teach this to. So I see a question asking PHP or Python. I definitely prefer Python over PHP. I'm not a huge PHP fan, and Python, I like the syntax. It works really well. It's useful in almost everything, machine learning especially, so I really like Python for that. Okay, it looks like pretty much everyone is trickling in at this point, which is great. So kind of to get started, let me move my camera over here so we can see what we're starting with. There we go. Oops, there we go. Okay, so to get started, I kind of want to just look at first the application that we're going to be reviewing, since I'm sure a lot of you weren't here, subscribed to the channel, or haven't watched the series where we built this application. But essentially the idea of this application is that it's a band website. So we have an about page, a home page, and a store page for any band that you want. I just called this band the generics because I didn't want to use a specific band, obviously for copyright issues and all that kind of stuff. And the idea is that this band website was just to teach the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's fairly simple design overall. So when doing a code review, the very first thing I like to do is kind of just look at all of the code that is running. I like to look at the running version of the code because that way I can actually see what the code is doing, how it's working, and that way if I make any changes, since this is kind of like a refactor code review, I know how those changes actually affect the code in a way. So I look at the code first, then I look at the final result of the code, and then we look at the actual code to figure out what we can change to make sure we don't break how it actually looked before. So on the home page, we have just here a really generic background image for our title. We have the title of the band at the very top, just a button. None of these buttons actually do anything. I can click them all I want. These are just placeholder buttons. Obviously, this is just for teaching purposes and not actually a full-blown website. We also have a play button for a song to play, obviously also not hooked up. And then just a table down here with all of the different tours. And then finally, all the pages have this footer that has just the band name and then links to YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook for this band. Next, we have the store. The store page is going to be where we're going to probably spend a lot of the time in this live stream just because it has the most amount of stuff going on inside of it. We have our add to cart buttons, which actually function. We can click them. We have these quantity numbers, which will change the total down here. We can remove things from the cart. A purchase button that'll also purchase these things. It obviously doesn't make any payments, but it will remove everything from the cart for us, as you can see. So this is going to be where we're going to spend quite a bit of time just because the JavaScript is quite a bit more involved on this page. And then lastly, the simplest page we have is the about page here, which just has some text, just lorem ipsum text, picture of the band, about. And then obviously one thing I already know I want to change is this footer. It doesn't expand all the way to the bottom here, which it really should. So That's one thing that I want to take a look at in this, is how we can get the footer to show up at the bottom of the page, because right now it's, floating, which just doesn't really look very good. So hopefully that gives you guys a general idea of where we're starting with for the actual finished product of this. It's a very simple web application. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of go through each one of these pages inside the code to see what we can actually change. So let's just drag this all the way up here. And sorry. So we'll start first with the index page, which is this page over here. And we have up at the very top our header section. And this I think actually looks pretty good. I mean, it's not the most amazing looking thing in the entire world, obviously, but I think it looks good enough. And the HTML over here to support it, it's really good. We have our header tag, which is great. You want to have that header tag to wrap your header. Good for semantic HTML, accessibility, that's really important. Also, we have the nav tag, wrapping our nav, that's really good. Everything is inside anchor tags, which is great. And we have hrefs pointing to the correct locations. That's good. You don't want to do something with like a button that does an on-click that redirects you. Always use anchor tags when you're doing links. That's just generally good advice. Also, you'll notice our links have hover states, which is really important. If you have something clickable on your page, you always want to make sure it has a hover state. So luckily, we already have that taken care of with our links here. And then moving on, we have an H1. This is a really good example here. We should be using an H1 because this is the main heading of our page. So we want to make sure that that's our largest heading, our H1. So that's really good that we use an H1 here. And then finally, we have just a simple container that has our buttons also inside of our header. So this all is generally pretty good. I like this code here. I like that we use buttons for this because this is a button that doesn't actually redirect you somewhere. So it's good to use a button. Same with this button down here, also really good. Now moving on, we have our section. Again, I really like that we used a section here because it's a part of our application that we can actually move somewhere else. Kind of the idea of a section is it's something that you can take and transport somewhere else in your application and it'll work just fine. So I really like that we use a section for this as opposed to just a div, for example. And then an H2, also really good. It's our heading for our section, so we put it inside of our section, which I really like. But then we run into probably the first thing, which I just absolutely hate, and that's this table, which, as you can see, isn't a table. It's just a bunch of divs and spans. And this is really bad. This is bad just for accessibility purposes because it's difficult to follow with screen readers, and also it doesn't have any semantic meaning. I know I built this with divs because I hate styling tables. They're just an absolute pain to style, but this should definitely be a table, and that's something for sure we're going to change over, is to make this a table instead of divs. It'll also help clean up our CSS, because if I jump into that and scroll down to the section, if I can find it, let's see, tour, you can see that we set everything using specific widths just like this, and that is just not very clean, not very good, so it's much better to just do those tables. The table will take care of all that width styling for you automatically, so we don't even have to worry about any of that, which is really nice. Also, I see a question, someone saying, well, I keep this on the channel. I'm going to keep this video on the channel. It's not going to disappear or anything, so you don't have to worry about missing out if you can't make it for the live stream. But with the live stream, you'll at least be able to ask questions and we'll be able to talk back and forth when we make changes. So I think if you want to stick around for the live stream, it's definitely worth it. But it will be up on the channel for you to review later if you want to, so you can look at it, watch it later, no problems. Also, I see a great comment here from Lorem Ipsum, perfect name, and it says, please use main instead of section. I definitely agree. That is one thing I was going to get to, is that this page is missing a main. The idea of the main element is it's supposed to wrap essentially the main content of your entire application. And in our case, this tour section is the main section. So instead of using a section here, we can just replace this with main. And all the way down here, we can also replace this with main. And what that's going to do is it's not going to change any of our CSS styling. As you can see, everything looks the same over here. But what it does do is it tells the browser that this is the main section of our application. Everything inside of this main, this is the part that is the most important. So for example, if you go into like screen reader mode or reader mode, like on your tablet, for example, it'll cut out a lot of the other things not in the main, like this header would disappear, this footer would disappear, and we would just have the main section inside of our application. And with main, you only ever want one main on your page at a time for accessibility reasons. Obviously, you can only have one section of main content, and you want to make sure that you have a main on every page, just so that the browser knows what that main section is. Now, if this page had multiple sections, we could wrap sections inside of these mains just fine. That's going to work, but we just want to have that one main section wrapping everything inside of our application. And remember, only one of them, not multiple of them. So that was a great suggestion from Lorem Ipsum. I really like that. And then Lucky Strike says, so should the header and footer be in the body? And yes, everything that is inside of your application should be inside the body tag. So the head tag is purely just for all of your metadata, your title, your style sheets, your JavaScript links, all of that is going to go in your head tag. And then everything else is going to go inside your body tag. Anything that's content on your page, as you can see here, has to be inside the body tag. So this includes your header, your nav, your footer, your main, all of that stuff. I also see a question here saying like this main content here, should it come from a database instead of being fixed content? The purpose of this site was purely for teaching HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So none of it is dynamic. It's purely all just a static site, which is perfectly fine for our use case. And a lot of times this information would be just static information. You may do it with some kind of build tool like Gatsby to build it dynamically, but it's going to just be static information for the most part, because these tour dates, for example, this is going to change a couple times a year. So updating your site a couple of times a year is not a big deal. And you're going to have a lot quicker site than if you loaded these from a database, for example, instead of just doing it statically like this. Okay, so now that we kind of have an idea of this index page, let's move on to the next page. Or actually, I guess the footer. We didn't talk about the footer. So this is wrapped in a footer tag, which is great. Again, same thing with the header. You want to make sure you wrap it in the footer tag, because it just makes sense for your website. It's going to be easier for screen readers to follow, easier for the browser to parse, all of that good stuff. And we have an H3 inside of here for this heading. I am kind of torn between whether or not I would want to use an H3 here or not. It's really not a heading for anything. So I almost think not using an H3 would be better. Just using, a generic div or span or something, because this is really not a heading per se. And then inside this band name class, we could just change the font, because obviously, or actually we already are changing the font size. So I really don't think a heading is a good thing to use here, just because it's not really a heading for anything. Generally with headings, you want to have it head content underneath of it. And as you can see, there's really no content under this. It's just this navigation here, which again, this is not inside of a nav tag. This should be inside of a nav tag, because this is actually navigation. As you can see, these are 3 separate links. So we should put this UL here inside of this nav tag, just like that. Make sure that's styled, save it, make sure everything looks good. It's a little bit off. I think we need to just move our classes for nav and footer nav up into there. Can remove them from here. Okay, either way, this is not quite styled exactly the same as it was before, so let's just look and inspect this to see why. We can expand this out and expand this out. So this is one thing when you're refactoring. You notice that these buttons moved over to the left, so you kind of had to figure out why that is. And we can just drill down into here, and we can check these classes on these navs. So we say nav and footer nav. I don't see any styling at all for them. So let's look into our CSS to see what those are. We can just search for footer nav. And you can see it's expecting an LI to be directly underneath of it. So that class of footer nav does need to be on our UL, just like that. And we can remove it here from our nav. Now if we save that, expand this out, still not quite looking right, so let's see what we have wrong. Let's expand this out. So we can see our LIs have the proper padding, our nav here is working well. Let's look at the style sheet again. We want to search for .nav. And this is expecting the LIs to be display inline. That seems right, that seems right. Whoops. So next thing we probably want to look for is our main footer container to see what that is styled as. We can see that this is flex grow, so most likely what's happening here, if I expand this out, is that if we highlight over these elements, is that it's not actually growing and being pushed to the far side of our page like this. What we most likely need to do is we want to justify content flex end, and this should actually be justify self flex end. Now hopefully what we should see, oops, we had to do that on the nav, I'm sorry. So justify content, justify self flex end, whoops. Of course I can't spell. There we go. So now if we look, still not moved over, unfortunately. Let's try to make this a flex grow of 1. There we go. Okay, so what the problem was is this nav wasn't growing to fill the entire space on the bottom of our page, so it was just stopping at its width. So what we can do is we want to do this on our nav for our footer. So we can just come and say, we want to do footer.nav. We'll just make a class called footer nav, or actually we already have footer nav, so we'll just say flex grow, because all we need to do is just make it grow. We can say flex grow 1. Now if we save that, make sure we refresh this, we see that everything's back to where it was before, so we know that this is working just like it should. Just reading through the comments here to make sure there's nothing going on. You guys are asking questions on. Oh, I see a great question here. What's the difference between putting script tag at the top and bottom of the body tag? So this is actually great because we finished up this section here for the most part. We're going to come back and do the table in just a little bit. But if we move on to our store page, this is actually where we have our script tag. So let me just expand this out. And you can see I actually put the script tag all the way up in the head of the section instead of in the body. Most people, what they do is they take this and they put it all the way at the bottom of the body. So right after here, the very last thing is you'll have your script tag, and it'll just look like this. And the way that this works is it actually loads through all of your HTML. So the browser comes through, it parses all the HTML, and then gets all the way to the bottom here, and it sees your script tag, and then it parses and loads your script tag. And when it's loading a script tag, it actually stops parsing anything else. So if we put this all the way at the top in our head, or at the beginning of our body, both of them are essentially the same. What happens is it hits the script tag, and then it stops parsing, and it finishes parsing the entire script tag, and then it moves on to parse the rest of the application. But we're using the async keyword, and you can use async or defer, and both of them are going to tell the browser to not stop parsing, so it's going to download the script tag, but it's going to continue to parse the rest of your HTML. And the difference between async and defer is async says as soon as you finish downloading the script tag, so for example it's parsing the HTML, and right here your script tag finishes downloading, what happens is it stops parsing, runs the script tag, and then picks back up parsing where it left off. With defer, which is actually what I would be changing this to, is what happens is it parses all of your HTML. Even if your store tag downloads inside of here, it just continues parsing all the HTML, all the way until it gets down to the very end, finishes parsing the HTML, and then it runs your script tag. And what that allows you to do is inside of our store here, we have some JavaScript telling us if the body has already been loaded, then we want to call ready, and if not, we want to wait for it to finish loading. But with defer, we already know that the body of our document is going to be loaded as soon as our JavaScript runs, so we can remove all this code and just call the ready function. We don't actually need to wait for the document to finish loading because it's already loaded, so we don't have to do any of those additional checks, which is really nice. And we can see if we go to our start page and we just click on something, you can see all of our JavaScript here is working just as it did before, so we didn't lose any of the functionality by changing this here all the way at the top to be defer. So we changed this to defer, and we came over here, and we could just remove that document loading code. This is something I definitely should have done when I wrote this the first time, but I wasn't super familiar with async defer when I wrote this, and that's why I used async instead of defer. So now I see a question, this is a great question, and it says, should I start using flex and grid to replace table or keep using table? And this really depends on the reason for using table. If you remember in our example here on the home page, we have an actual table of data. This is data that is formatted in a table. This should use table. But if you're using table specifically just to lay out things in an orderly fashion, definitely use flex or grid. But this is actual table data. As you can see, it forms columns and rows, which is how a table actually works. But if you're just trying to store information that's not in a table format, for example, it's not actually specific columns and rows that relate to each other, then in general using flex or grid is better. They're just more powerful for styling things. It's much easier to work with than tables, and tables should only be used for specifically tabular data like this. The reason I actually did this with Flexbox is because it's so much easier to style things with Flexbox, and tables are a real pain to deal with all the extra borders and stuff that you have to deal with. So that's why I did Flexbox on this, but I really should use a table, and we're going to come back and change this to a table as soon as we get through the rest of our pages. So back into the store HTML, we have our header, which is exactly the same, so I'm not going to bother changing this. This is already good. We already know this is good. Again, using H1 here, which is great. And you will notice, again, there's no main section anywhere inside of here. So we want to make sure we wrap our main content, which in our case, it's going to be this first section of our albums, this merch section, as well as our cart. So we can just come in here, we can say main, And what we want to do is we want to put all of our content, except for the header and footer, inside of there. So we can just copy, all the way from this section to this section. And we just want to put this inside of our main here. And I just want to make sure I indent that properly. And there we go. Well, for the most part, that's indented well. Looks like it's missing something somewhere. Here we go. There we go. So now that's all indented properly. So now we actually have a main section. Again, this is really important. You should have this on every page, as I mentioned earlier. Next, we have our sections, which have headings at the beginning of them. And one thing to note is this is an H2 heading, which is above, like an H1 is above this H2. So it follows kind of like a document outline. You always want your smaller headers to be underneath your larger headers. You don't want to have this be an H2 and then this be an H1, because that just doesn't make sense to have a larger header underneath a bigger header or a smaller header. So this is why we're using H2 here. And you can see in all of our sections we have an H2, and that denotes these are all equal level items, which, as you can see here, inside of this example, if I just scroll this over, you can see these are all equal level items. We have our music, our merch, and our cart. They all are essentially at the same level of the document. One of them is not inside of the other, so we don't have to worry about nesting our headers to make them smaller and smaller. That's why we can share H2 between all of these different headers. Other than that, this is pretty straightforward. I'm just using Flex to style this. So as you can see, we have that dynamic change when the browser gets too small. And this is all just taken care of by Flexbox. We don't actually have any media queries to do this. It's just simple Flexbox. And over here in our code, really this is actually pretty good, I think, for the most part. We have our H2, which is our section here, and each one of our shop items, let's dive into that just a little bit. There are these divs. And you can see that we have a span, which has the title. I think this should actually be changed. Potentially this should be like an H3 or an H4, something that denotes that this is actually the heading of this section. So we can change this to an H3, for example, instead of using the span. This image tag I think is fine, but you will notice there's no alt tag on this image tag. And what an alt tag allows you to do is essentially for screen readers. So for people that can't actually see the screen and it's reading them what's on the screen, this alt tag will actually be read to them instead of actually showing the image. So what we can do is we can put an alt in here. We can just say that this is going to be t-shirt, for example, because we're right here. This is where we are. So this is just an alt tag. It'll read to them t-shirt because obviously they can't see that this is an image. So it'll just tell them that this is the t-shirt inside of the picture. Next, we have our shop details. We have this wrapped in a div. And the reason we're using a div is just because there's no actual styling going on with this section, or there's no actual meaning. It's just for styling purposes. So that's what the div is for. And then a span here, as well as a button. And one thing to note is we definitely do not want to use an A tag here. Some people may use anchor tags for this, but an anchor tag implies that you're going somewhere, whether it's linking to a section on the page or going to a different page on your website. For example, these links up here. So you don't want to use an A tag when you're not doing those. So an A tag is great for linking to things, but a button is for when you're doing things on the same page. For example, we're adding this to the cart, so we're actually modifying our page. And that's why we want to use this button element here instead of an A tag. Never use A tags when you actually are just doing something that a button does. And never use a button when you're trying to navigate to a different page. That's specifically what A tags are for, and buttons are specifically for just modifying the content on the page. Other than that though, just that small change of the H3 and the alt tag, I think this shop item is good. And we could go through and change all of these individual shop items, but it's going to be the same changes, and I don't think you want to sit here and watch me change the same thing over and over and over and over again. So I'm just going to assume we changed one, and then we're just going to assume that we changed all the rest of them as well. And now lastly, we can move on to our cart section. Again, it's a section with an H2, which is great. And here again, we kind of have that problem. We're using div instead of tables. This should really be a table for the styling purposes, because this is very clearly a table. We have our headers, we have our content inside of here. So we should definitely use a table for styling here instead of using divs and spans and flexbox. But that again is something that we're going to tackle later. I actually probably won't change this to a table in this stream just because we'd have to change all of the JavaScript code as well, because all of this depends on using divs and spans for all the different rows. So I probably won't tackle it in this live stream just because it'll be really repetitive and boring watching me change it. But do know that using divs and spans here is a very bad idea. We definitely should be using a table with table headers. And like I said, we'll change that inside of this index section, but we're going to get to that after going through all of the different pages. Other than that, if we look down here, we have just kind of a strong tag saying that there's emphasis on this total here. Span for our price, all this looks pretty good. And then lastly, of course, a button for purchasing, which again is great. And our footer section, I'm not going to make the same changes we made on the index. we just want to make sure we wrap this in a nav, obviously, because it's going to be a navigation element. So yeah, Arthur here is mentioning, so main and section is for indication purposes only. And yeah, that's true. Like main and section, they style exactly the same as a div. They're just block level elements with no default styling to them. But what they do is they give semantic meaning to your page. So the browser knows that this section is an individual piece of content in your page. So it knows that it's a distinct section that's different than this section up here. If I made this a div, for example, instead of a section, the browser doesn't really have any idea of what this is. It just thinks, okay, this is something. That's what a div is. It's something. It doesn't know what it is. It could be nothing. It could be something. It could be a section. It doesn't know. But with section, it's saying this is a discrete piece of information that's all congregated into this one single section, and it's all related to each other. As you can see, this is our cart section. Everything inside of here is related to this cart right here. Same thing with our merch section. It's all related to this merch here. And as for main, if we scroll up a little bit to where we can see that, main is very similar to section, except for instead of being a discrete single piece of information, it is what is the main overall purpose of this page? What is the content on this page that is most important? Again, it works just like a div for styling purposes, but it at least tells the browser what's going on and why what the purpose of that page is. What is the most important content on that page? So I also see here someone saying that should you use like Bootstrap as a library or create all your own custom CSS? This is largely up to you. I think when you're first learning and getting started and you are focusing on maybe JavaScript or you're focused on HTML or you're focused on the backend, using Bootstrap is great because it's really easy. Like you don't have to worry about learning a bunch of intricate CSS and you can just focus on what you're trying to learn, which is the JavaScript. But if you want to focus on learning CSS and styling and design and all of that, I highly recommend writing your own custom CSS. I personally enjoy writing CSS, and I don't like using frameworks like Bootstrap because they really tie me down. They kind of force me to do things the Bootstrap way, and when I want to break out of the Bootstrap way, it's really difficult to make changes to that. So I generally write most of my CSS from scratch. As you can see for this application, all the CSS is from scratch. There's no Bootstrap, there's no libraries, it's just straight CSS that we wrote for this application. And that makes it really easy to change things. And with grid, like CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox, a lot of the big benefits of Bootstrap, such as their grid system, are really not that useful anymore. And creating your own custom buttons is actually fairly easy if we just find our button code here. You can see that we really just have this little bit of code here for our buttons and then this little bit of code for our primary button. It's really like 10 lines of code to create our very own custom button. So that's really not that difficult. And so a lot of the things people really enjoy about Bootstrap, such as the grid system and the buttons, those are really not that hard to do on your own. So I highly recommend if you want to, become a more full, well-rounded developer, especially on the front end side of things, to just dive in and learn CSS, write your own CSS, because it'll make you learn so much about CSS just by having to figure it all out on your own, rather than working around what Bootstrap has. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's move on to our very last page here, which is going to be the smallest one, and that is our About section. And if I zoom this out, you can see that our thing doesn't go all the way down to the bottom of the page, which is really annoying. This is something that we want to fix. But other than that, the rest of this is really fine. I really like that the image here gets the text wrapped around it. That looks really good. Our About section has the nice section header here. And if we look at our HTML, we can see that our header is the same as it's always been. This looks great. We have a section here, which really, as we know, should be a main because this section is our main content. So let's come all the way down here and say main. So now that we have that wrapped properly, you can see we have our h2 with our header and our image, which this should of course have an alt tag. So we want to write an alt tag. We can just say band members performing, just like that. Essentially, it's just a description of what the image is so that if you can't see the image, you get read the alt tags so you just know what's going on. You always should have alt tags for your images, no matter what, because it just makes the life of people using screen readers so much better for your website instead of it just saying this is an image, because obviously you have no idea what that means. So now let's zoom this back out a little bit, and we can actually work on styling this so that our footer is all the way at the bottom of the page here. And we can just do that with this main footer instead of our styles. And what I'm going to do is actually use sticky position for this. So if we go to our main footer, we can just change the display here to sticky. And then what we can do is we can change the bottom to 0. Let's inspect this just to make sure, see what I'm doing wrong. I don't use sticky position too often, so I just want to make sure I fully understand it. Main footer displays. Or sorry, not display. This should be position. What am I doing? Okay, position sticky. So now let's see if that worked. If I expand this all the way out. Of course not. Okay. Inspect it again. Bring this out. So where's our main footer? Here's main footer container. Main footer. Okay, position sticky, bottom 0. Let's see here. Oh, of course that's not going to work. What am I thinking? Okay, yeah, so with the bottom 0 like this, it's just going to stick to the bottom of our page. Obviously, we don't know. I don't know why I was thinking that was going to work. Let's scratch that idea, zoom back out, remove these, so everything's back to how it was before. And what we really want to do is we want to make it so that our about section, essentially our entire page is going to expand to fill the full height of our page, and that this is just going to be stuck at the very bottom of our page. So if we go into our about.html, we have our main section here, and we can just say, for example, full size. Whoops, size. Just like that. And then instead of our styles, we'll just scroll all the way to the bottom for this. There we go. We have main, whoops, full size, just like this. What we want to do is we want to make this take up the entire height of our HTML. So if we go, gotta scroll all the way to the top, wherever I define HTML, min height 100%. Okay, we already have the min height to 100%, that's good. Probably should change this to view height so that it's going to be 100% of the height of our entire screen, just like that. And now what we want this to do, we want our full size to be, if we just change the height here to 100%, this is going to be far too large. Oops. Min height. Let's see here, okay, full size, yep. Body, footer. Let's go back to styling our main footer, because I feel like we were close on that. So if we set this to be the bottom of 0, position absolute, that's going to put us all the way to the bottom. We could put left 0, right 0. Obviously that's going to work, but the one problem though is obviously our text is going to be cut off on the bottom here. Change it back to sticky. I always hate styling things that have to expand to the full height, because really the easiest way to do it is to change your entire structure of your HTML so that everything's 100% height and that you have flex grow on this middle content. So I guess that's what we're going to do, just because that'll be the easiest. So inside of our body here, we're just going to put a class of full size. And instead of our main, we're going to put in the flex grow in here, which is a class we already created for growing. So now we can come back, do that full size. Make sure I didn't define this anywhere else. Nope, okay. So inside of full size, what we want to do is we want to change the display to flex, and we want to change the flex direction here, which is going to be column. And now as you can see, that's worked. What this essentially is doing is it's changing this entire page to be a flex layout, and then we're making this middle section, our main section, grow to fill all of the content that's possible. So it's growing to the full height of our entire page, which is 100%, and then this is just being stuck down to the bottom. If we remove that flex grow, so if we just remove this, everything's going to be exactly the same as it was before, but with flex grow, we're just saying this about section should take up the entire height of our container. Generally, I don't like styling things this way if I don't have to, just because it's kind of a pain to work with, because you have to make sure you always flex grow your thing that you want to grow, and you have to make sure there's only one thing that you have to worry about growing. But in this case, it works really well. Our footer is stuck at the bottom. If we zoom in, you can see our footer still stays at the bottom, and it doesn't overlap any of our text. So this is probably the best way to do that in this use case, and something that I've done in a lot of different sites. And the way this trick works is we have display flex here, which allows us to do flex grow to make something grow. And by changing the flex direction back to column, It essentially lays everything out almost exactly the same as it was before. It essentially makes everything as if it was a div, and in our case, luckily all these sections work like divs, they're block level elements. So this is just going to work just like our original site was before. It's kind of a nice trick that I like to do. The only time this won't work is if you have a span thrown in there. So if, for example, we had just a random span inside of here, this is now not actually going to be a span, it's going to be a div. You see they're going to line up on top of each other like this, when if you didn't have this flex column and display flex, you'd see that these spans are lined up right next to each other. Whoops. That's really the only time that you're going to have to worry about this problem, but obviously for our case, as I said, we don't have actual span content, there's no inline content, so we don't have to worry about that. Yeah, I see other people saying that they always have problems with footers. It is one of the most painful things to work with, making sure your footer is always stuck to the bottom of the page, but in this case, this is a nice little trick that I like to use to do that, so hopefully that can work in your websites as well. Other than that though, this about section, I really like this about section, it works well. One thing I just thought of though, is if we scroll down here, all the way into our footer, you notice we have images without alt tags down here as well. These should really say alt, YouTube for example, alt, Spotify, probably should say logo, and of course, alt, Facebook, logo. Essentially, you always want to make sure you have alt tags in your images, so now that people, when they hover over these, instead of it just saying link to image, they're going to know it's a link to Facebook since it's the Facebook logo. That's just a little something that'll help there. Now let's move over all the way back to our index. As I said, we're going to change this out to be a table instead of divs and spans. So the first thing we want to do is figure out exactly where this section is. Starts right here. And you can see we can just start it off with a table, close off that table, and then inside of this table, we're going to have our head. So we're going to have a T head. This is going to put all of our header information. For example, in our application, we don't actually have any header. So we're just going to change to T body instead. And this is going to be T body. Normally, if you had a header, for example, date, location, that kind of stuff, you would put those in the T head, but we don't have any. And then we just need a table row. And inside of that, we have some different cells inside that table. So the first one is going to be this July 16th. Just copy that in. Copy this down a couple times. Gonna do Detroit, and of course, music theater here. And we want our button, so we'll just copy the whole button inside of this TD, just like that. Now if we save that, obviously this looks terrible. Let's remove all of these classes for tour related stuff. There we go. So now that's looking a little bit better. And with our table, we want this to essentially just take up the entire width. So we're going to put a class here. We're going to call it table tour row. And inside of our styles, whoops, table tour, not table tour row, because obviously it's not a row. There we go. And inside of here, we're just going to change the display to flex. I'm sorry, not display to flex. We're going to change the width to 100%. And there we go, that's taking up the entire width. And as you can see, it's already styled a lot like a table, which is great. Now what we can do is we can come in, just copy this row down one more time, and you can see now we have two rows in our table, but you will notice we obviously don't have these underlines in our sections. Also, this should have a class here of tour date. That will give it the bold text, as you can see. Let's copy this up to both of them, just like that. As you can see, we now have that bold text on both of these, which is great. And the next thing we're going to do is we can apply a class to our rows. So we can just say class here is going to be we'll say table tour row. Only reason we're doing that is so it's different than our tour row class that already exists. And we'll say table tour row. What we want to do is we want that border on the bottom. So let's look at how we did this in our tour row class. We can essentially just copy this all the way down here. Save that. And of course that's not working. Let's see here. Border, 1 pixel, solid, black. Let's just see what that looks like. Oh, of course, I know what our problem is. So I'm trying to style this TR. Obviously we can't do that. We need to style our TDs. So we can just say here that we want our table tour row, and then we want to style the actual TD to have that border bottom. So let's paste that border bottom back down. Let me copy it again, border bottom. all the way back down here. Now, as you can see, we have our border on the bottom just like this, and we want to remove any of our margin. So we'll say margin 0. Let's see, let's inspect this. See exactly what's causing that slight spacing between our elements. So we got our TDs, margin 0. So I see a question actually that I'm just going to talk about right now. So I see it says, why is using table better in this case? And the reason I want to use table here is because this is tabular data. It has distinct columns that correspond with a specific label. Same with here, we have specific columns for specific things. And I just think it's generally better to navigate for people using screen readers to navigate tables as opposed to navigating just divs and spans. They'll have a better idea of how the content is structured. They know if they move down, they're moving across the dates, for example, or the cities or the locations. If they move across, that the next content is always going to be, for example, date is followed by city, city is followed by location, and so on. So I think it's just better for the screen readers in this case. Also, I see here that our border spacing is what we need to change, not our margin. So we can just change the border spacing to be 0. Now if we save that, of course that didn't actually change anything. Let's see. I'm sorry, that should be on our TD, or on our TR. So we can just say table, tour, row, border spacing 0, and still nothing. See, I don't use tables very often, so this is new for me. Collapse on the table, you think that's what it is? We'll try. Say border collapse. Collapse. That didn't do it. Oh, on the actual table itself. Genius. Thank you very much for that. Okay. So we just had to change our border to be collapse. Let's put that inside of our table tour here. Thank you for that tidbit. So now we have a straight line all the way across with no spacing since we are collapsing our borders together across them. So what was happening is we had vertical borders here on the left and right, which were essentially transparent. And this is just collapsing those vertical borders so that they're a part of our border here. Also, I think we had padding bottom of 1 REM. And we also had a margin bottom of 1 REM as well between our different elements. Oh, it's not a margin bottom. That's not working very well. I guess let's go into our index here and remove all of our old div content. So we're just left with our table. There we go. So now we just have these two elements here. Oops, back to our CSS. And we just want to put a little bit of spacing between these, padding on the bottom, margin on the bottom. Margin is not doing anything. Let's see here. Margin bottom. Let's try margin on the top. I guess we could just change this to be padding on the top. And we must be missing a class because obviously this bottom row is not being styled. So let's see here. Yes, we need to apply this tour row to this TR as well. There we go. So now we actually have the line being shown up. And what we can do is we can just say here, we want to have margin on the bottom of the entire table to 1 REM. And that just gives us a little bit of space between these elements. We can also copy this selector because we wanted to get the last child and we want no border on the bottom. So we'll just change that to none. Now if we save that, whoops, we want the last child for our row. So we want the last row to have no border, not the last cell. There we go. That got rid of the border on the very bottom. And now if we just copy this another time, I'm not going to worry about changing the dates or anything. As you can see, we have essentially the same table we had before. If I close out of this, you can see our spacing is automatically assigned for us. As you can see, we don't have any fancy classes defining our widths. It's just choosing the widths automatically since it's a table. You can see all of our buttons are lined up well. Everything just looks better in my opinion since it lines itself up better. It's going to work just as well. You know, people in screen readers are going to be able to tab through this, use the arrow keys, go up and down, be able to navigate this much easier than divs and spans. And our styling looks essentially exactly the same. So we've achieved what we wanted. We didn't change the look of the page, and we were able to increase the accessibility by using tables. Yeah, I love this comment here. It says, you haven't coded CSS until you change random stuff and see what happens. That is so true. This is pretty much how I code all my CSS. I just go in here, I change something, save it, see what happens, and then if it doesn't work, I'll eventually just inspect the page and just manually start changing things in the element style until I eventually get it working how I want. And then I hope that I copy and paste everything over to my CSS, because then when I refresh, almost always I forget something, and then I have to remember what I changed. Oh, it's such a pain. But I don't know why, but I still love CSS. It's so fun. Okay, so now that we've got the styling for our HTML done, we have it much more semantic than it was before. With alt tags, we have tables. Instead of our store here, we have main sections, all of that good stuff. The next thing I want to focus on is going to be the JavaScript for this application, because it's a little bit ugly. You might have gotten a little bit of a sneak peek of it already, but it's using a lot of older syntax, such as var. It's using just normal functions, no arrow functions, all of this document.getElement by class name, normal for loops. And the reason I did this when I created this tutorial the first time is that it's meant for like absolutely beginners. And I figured beginners were most likely going to run across tutorials using var instead of let and const. And I didn't want to confuse them by throwing in another way to define variables. So I was like, I'm just going to stick with var, stick with normal for loops. But in general, I never use var when I'm actually programming JavaScript. I don't really even use normal for loops that often. So what I want to do is actually update this code to what I would make it look like using more modern practices. And as you've seen, we already changed this by getting rid of our document loading state by using our defer attribute instead of our store here. You remember we use defer here, so we can actually just assume that our document is already loaded, which is a great way to get started. And now the next thing I would do is obviously change these to be constant variables. We're never going to be changing this remove cart buttons. Same with quantity input, add to cart buttons. None of these are actually going to get changed. So immediately I would change these to const. And if we check, everything's just working as it was before, so clearly we haven't broken anything yet, which is great. Next thing I would do is I would actually loop through these cart buttons. So what we can do is we can just say remove cart item buttons dot for each, and we're going to use here document.query selector all, and we want to just get by that class .button danger. And the reason for that is that we actually have access to for each on query selector all, and we don't have access to for each on the get elements by class name. What you would need to do is say something like array.from, and if we do array.from, this is going to convert this to an actual array where we can use for each on it, but just using query selector all is just as easy, and I generally enjoy using query selector all over get elements by class name, just because I think it's easier to have the same shorter syntax everywhere inside of your code. Now instead of this for each, we're going to use arrow functions. We know that we have a cart item, just like that. We're going to call it button actually, because that's what we called it down here. And we can just copy this code for adding the event listener, paste it in here, and there we go. Now let's make sure that works. If we click remove, it removes. So we know that all the code that we changed didn't actually break anything, which is great. And already this is a lot cleaner than the code was down here. And let's just use the array.from so you can see how that works. We can say for each, and I think I called it input inside of here, as you can see. So for each input, we're just going to copy down this input event listener, remove all this code, and now when we change this, it should update our totals, and as you can see it does. So again, we haven't broken anything, which is great. Just reading through some of the comments here. Query selector all, less code, heart. Yes, very true. I love it. Do you use Control plus D for next same selection? I'm pretty sure Control plus D actually deletes the line. Oh, it does not. Oh, wow, that's really nice. I've never used Control D. So yeah, that's kind of cool. So Control D lets you select multiple of the same thing. So I can just say Control D, and it's going to select the next word that has the exact same text. So as you can see, it's highlighting this add event listener, and I can change both of them at the same time. That's really cool. Never used that before. Thanks for the tip. Control F2 to select all similar text. Really? Control F2. Oh, it's a lot like Control D, but it does all of them at once. That's really cool. It's great for refactoring, I guess. If I wanted to change, for example, remove cart item buttons, I could just say Control F2, and I could change it to remove buttons. Now if I save that, it should work just as before. Oh, that's really nice. Thank you for all these tips. I love it. Okay, so moving on, that's kind of how I would clean up this. Obviously do the same thing here. I'm not going to do it just for time purposes. You don't want to watch that. Here's another great example. I'm getting elements by class name, and then I'm getting the very first one. This is a great example of where query selector would work, because query selector gets one single element always, we can just say we want to get the button purchase. We can remove this here for getting the very first one, and now that should work. When we click purchase, you can see the alert is still working, so this is working just as before. But obviously query selector is a lot easier to write than get elements by class name with the 0 at the end. Same thing down here, we can use query selector, make sure that we put the period here since it's a class, and we can remove getting the first element from the array. That again just makes it so much easier to deal with. So now reading through some more of this code, we can see we have a while loop here to remove all of the children inside the cart items. Another thing you can do to fix this is you can say cart items.inner HTML is just going to be equal to blank. So now if we comment out this code here, so when we hit purchase, it should remove everything from our cart. So let's just add a couple things to the cart. There we go, and we click purchase, all of this should disappear. And we click purchase, and you can see it all disappears, and adding things to the cart still works just as before. So this is just an easier way to clear something if you want to. Either way works just fine, so it's really whatever you want to do, but this is just a really quick way to clear things from a cart or from any HTML element rather than having to loop through and individually remove each child. Let's see what else we got down here. Again, all these get elements by class name with a single thing at the end. Just change these to query selector, change this to a class, and remove that. It's going to just make your code much easier. As you can see, this used to wrap multiple lines, now it's on one line. Shorter, easier to work with. It makes more sense logically, because you think get elements by class name, okay, I'm getting a bunch of things. Oh, but I'm actually only getting one thing. It's just kind of confusing. So this makes it much more simple and straightforward what you're trying to do. I see a bunch of people asking for a chat application tutorial. I already have one on my channel you can check out. I actually have a two-part video. I did one part on the chat app and a second part on creating rooms for the chat application, so you can check that out. Let's see what else you guys are saying. So a bunch of people are asking why I'm not using a framework for this application. This again, like I mentioned, was purely for teaching JavaScript. So I didn't want to use a big complicated framework for doing that. And also, this is a fairly straightforward, simple set of code. There's not very many lines to this JavaScript, and doing this all in a framework like React would add a bunch of complexity and overhead to something that is really pretty straightforward and doesn't actually need all that extra complexity of React. Really, the only thing that React would help with would be changing this div here to no longer be using inner HTML. It would just be a lot easier to write this section, but this is still not that difficult to write using inner HTML, so in my opinion, using React for this application just doesn't make sense. I wouldn't use it just because of how small it is. If you wanted to learn React, sure, go ahead, use React for this, but if you're purposely doing this to like make a product for someone or you want to create an end result, React is not going to be the best option. It's also going to remove all your SEO benefits because you're going to be client rendering everything. It's going to be slower. So in general, for this kind of an application, definitely just use plain JavaScript. You don't need jQuery either for this because anything that jQuery helps you with, such as selecting elements, we can just use query selector for nowadays, or query selector all, and it's going to do the exact same thing as what jQuery would have done for us. You really don't need jQuery anymore, in my opinion. Let's see what else you guys are asking. Okay, I see. This is a great question. I was going to get to this. So he says, instead of binding a button to delete an element every time we create a button, is it not better to perform delegated binding? Is delegated binding possible in plain JavaScript? So what this question is asking is, as you can see here, when we're adding a row to our cart, what we're doing is we're adding our event listeners right here to our new buttons that we just created. We have our button here for removing the element, and we also have an input span here, and we're adding input event listeners to that every single time we create a new button, which is really kind of a pain to do. What we could have done is all the way up here in our ready function, we can actually, we'll just do it all the way up here. We can use our document, and we can add an event listener to the document. And let me scroll down to see what event listener we're listening to, just so I make sure it's exactly the same. We are listening to click, and we are calling remove cart item. So we can say that we want to listen for click on the document. And what we can do is inside of here, we have our E, which is our event, and we can say e.target, this is what's actually clicked. So for example, this button, this would fire for that button, and I can just console.log to show this, just so we understand exactly what's going on. So now if I inspect, now our document, every time we click our document, it's going to tell us what we clicked. So if we click this button, and I go to the console. Make sure I clear this, click the button. You can see that we got that button. As I highlight, you see it's selecting that button. If I click the image, you can see it's telling us we clicked on the image. So this is just whatever we clicked on. And we can say, I think it's .matches, I believe. And we can pass in here a selector. In our case, let's see what the selector that we were matching on was. Scroll all the way back down here. We have our cart row button danger class. So if we scroll all the way up here, what we want to say is we want to get something that matches .button danger. So now if we save this, inspect over here, this is going to return true or false for if the thing we clicked matches that selector. So if we click here, false, obviously none of these buttons actually do, but if we click remove, you see we get true being returned. So we can actually create this event listener once right here, and we can actually determine what it selects based on this e.target.matches. So let's just move this back, and we can just say if e.target.matches, then we want to run the code inside of here. So what we can do is we can call that, remove cart item function, and I think we want to pass it our event because we're actually using that inside of the function, I believe. Yeah, we are. Okay, so we pass it the event, which is great. And now what we can do is we can actually remove this code here. So now we aren't actually adding the event listener when we create the item. We're only adding the event listener once to the document up here, and we're just delegating that event onto the button danger and calling remove cart item only if we click the button danger. So let's just make sure this works. We add an item, add another item. If we click remove, you can see it removes it. Same with this one, but we're not dynamically adding these event listeners every single time. As you can see, we're not actually creating that event listener here anymore. So we can do that once and delegate that event all the way down based on this e.target.matches. If you're familiar with jQuery, this is essentially the same as saying document.click. We'll say document.on click. And then what we do is we pass in this selector here, .button danger. And then you would pass it in your actual function. So in our case, this would be remove cart item. So this code in jQuery is exactly the same as this code right here. They do exactly the same thing. And I'm sure behind the scenes, the jQuery code looks very similar to this. It just matches to make sure that these are the same, and then calls that function that you pass it with the event. Yeah, .matches is great. I also didn't realize .matches existed for quite a while until I looked up, I Googled exactly this. I was like, how do I do this cool jQuery thing, but in normal JavaScript? And I saw the .matches, and I was like, wow, this is exactly what I was looking for. It's essentially like a query selector, except for you're query selecting yourself just to make sure that you match that selector. It's really cool. Yeah, I see someone else saying that jQuery is dead. I don't want to say necessarily jQuery is dead, but it's definitely on the decline. jQuery is really only used in applications that already use jQuery. Like, you're going to keep jQuery in an application that uses it just because it's a real pain to remove since almost everything touches jQuery. But most people aren't going to create new applications using jQuery because you can do these kinds of things already based on normal JavaScript. And you can even just create, for example, a function, and you can just call it delegate, or we can call it add delegated event, and we can make it take in, for example, our element, selector, and our callback. And what we can do is just this exact code in here, except for instead of document, this is going to be element, our selector is what we're going to put inside of our matches, and our callback is what we're going to call with the event here. And now we can just call this function. We can say add delegated event on our document, document. We want to select .button danger, and we want to call the remove cart item. So it has almost identical syntax as you can see up here. Oh, also we need to make sure we pass it the event that we want to listen to, obviously. So we can say event. So now we have almost identical syntax as this jQuery version up here, and we can just remove this. Let's put this function actually inside of our application so it's usable, just like that. And now if we add this to cart, something's broken. Let me see what I did wrong. Go to the console. Oh, of course, remove the jQuery code, obviously. And now if we click add to cart and click remove, of course, again, something's not working. Let's see what I did wrong. I'm not calling the function anymore. I want to call add delegated event to the document. We want to call it on click. We want to match the button, So remove, I think. Yeah, we'll say remove. I think that's what it was. And we want to call remove cart item. There we go. Now, click this. Whoops. Maybe it's button danger. There we go. Okay, so now we have this really nice API essentially to work with that is exactly the same as a jQuery API, but we're using just plain vanilla JavaScript for doing that. So if you want to use this a lot in your application, I recommend making a function similar to this that's going to do exactly that for you and follow the same API as a jQuery. Just reading through some of the comments here to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, looking pretty good. So now let's just kind of navigate through this code to see if there's anything else that we could change, anything that's just kind of ugly. One thing that I do think React would make easier in this application is the update cart total function. You can see we call this in a bunch of different places, and that's because every time we add an item to the cart, we need to update this. Every time we change our quantity, we need to update this. Every time we remove something, we need to update this. So there's a lot of places that we need to update this cart total, and React would just automatically update that for us when we changed our state of the cart. But with plain JavaScript, we have to manage that state ourselves, which is a bit of a pain, but it's really not that bad in the grand scheme of things, and it could be a lot worse. So overall, just having this update cart total all over the place is kind of a pain, but it's really not that bad. Let's keep going down. As you can see, we have our loop here. This is just a normal for loop. Again, I'd probably change this to be, for example, cart rows dot for each, obviously, instead of a normal for loop like this, because these for loops just, when you use a for loop and all you're doing is getting each element inside of it, a for each loop is just almost always going to be a better option for you in that case. Let's see, again, a bunch of elements of using query selector. I'm not going to replace all of them. Obviously, that'd be really boring to watch, and I don't think you want to watch that. Let's see, anything else? Because a lot of times when I'm doing a code review, I'm doing this a little bit different than I normally do, but I would just read through all the code. I would just go through here, start to bottom, and try to understand exactly what's going on inside the code. That way I have a better understanding of where to look, but sitting here watching me read code for 15 minutes is really, really boring for you. So I'm kind of trying to skim things just so it's more interesting for you. Let's see. Okay, here's something that kind of jumps out as a red flag for me immediately. I have a button clicked, so whatever button we click, we're removing the parent element. Now that is a red flag because if inside of our HTML for the store, we changed how our cart was designed, or I guess this is actually defined in the JavaScript. Let's say we changed this. We added another div in here that wraps our button. So we just put our button inside of another div element. This is no longer going to work. When we click remove, you see it's not removing the right stuff. And this is a problem. You don't want your JavaScript code to be dependent on your HTML structure. Instead, what I would prefer to do, if we find that code back, is instead of basing it on parent elements, what I would do is button clicked dot dataset dot row target, for example. So what this is saying is there's a data attribute on our button, which is our row target. And what we can do is we can just say document.query selector. Actually, we can just get the parent of the button. So we can say button clicked dot parent. Oops, not parent. I believe it is closest. And this is going to get the closest parent that has this selector, which is row target. And then we can just say dot remove. And now we can remove this. And down here, we just need to add that data attribute to our button. So we can say data, what is it? Parent ID, is that what I called it? Or parent target? Let's see, row target. Row target. And we can set that equal to something. For example, we'll just say, what is it? Our row is called cart item, I believe. Make sure that's a selector. So period here. And now hopefully, cross our fingers, this should work. Oh, of course it's not. So let's see, cart item. Oh, of course, it's actually not cart item. It is cart row. I was correct. So change this to cart row. And now if we add and click remove, you see it works. Even with our extra div here, if we remove this div, back to how it was before, and save, it's still working. And the reason this is working is if we inspect this, zoom this out, you can see that we have our cart row, and inside of our button, we have our data row target, which is our dot cart row. So what's happening is this button is finding the closest parent element with the selector cart row, which in that case is this cart row here. You can see I highlighted, it's that blue section. And when I click remove, it is finding that and then actually removing this entire cart row section, just like this. And if we had multiple things, you can see it's only removing the one associated with itself. Doesn't matter what order we do it, it's always going to remove the one that's associated with itself. And the best part about this is that it's not dependent on the structure of our HTML. We're not using parent selector, .parent selector, .parent selector. What we're doing is just, if I can find it back, we're just getting that attribute which we defined on our button itself. This is something that I really like doing, is putting data attributes that point to other things that I want to modify. That way I don't depend on the HTML structure. All I'm saying is that this button has some parent which has some selector and we want to remove it. We could go even farther and make it not depend on being a parent by just using document.querySelector. But what we need to do is make sure that this target selector is actually unique across the entire page. And with our setup, we're just making sure it's unique for the actual individual button because they all share the same selector of that cart row. But since each one of them only has one parent cart row, it's only going to delete that one parent cart row. Let's see, any other questions coming up? Doesn't look like it, so let's continue looking to see if there's anything else sticking out. Let's see, adding item to the cart, that looks good. Again, as I mentioned before, we could change this cart quantity input to work exactly the same. Let me just copy this up. So now if we try to change our quantity, it's not going to update our total because we removed that selector. But if we come up in here, we can just copy this add delegate event. We want to delegate it to the document. We want it to be our change event, which is the same here. We want to call quantity changed, and we want to do it for our cart quantity input class, just like that. Now we save that, and we can see that this is now updating our total down here when we change our quantity of our input, which is great. Okay, back down. Let's see if there's anything else. I think we're getting to the point where there's really not much left I would change. This image tag, I would have an alt on this for sure. And I would most likely define this alt inside of, here we have our image source being passed in. I would pass in some form of alt. Obviously, we're not passing anything in, so we can't actually do this, but I would have some kind of alt being passed in. And I'm just going to default it here for now to cart item. This is obviously not something you would want to do, but since I'm not going to go through the effort of adding alts to all of these, this is just going to be, for our case, what the alt would be. And the way you would get that alt, actually, we can just do it. We can say image alt is going to be our shop item image, and we want to just get the alt. And now we can pass the alt in like that. And this is going to be image alt. Actually, I'll spell it out, image alt, just like that. And just like that. Now, if we add an element to the cart, we should have the same alt tag on both of these. I don't think all of these have alts. I think only the t-shirt I added an alt to. So let's just check that. If we click on here, you can see our alt says t-shirt, which is perfect. So we're now actually taking the alt from this image and putting it down into this image here, which is great. Let's see if there's anything else. So someone's asking, can I use this dot parent? So if we go back up to that section up here with the remove cart item, instead of using the event here, we could use this is what they're saying. And one problem with this is technically, yes, you could use this, but when we're doing these delegated events like this, this is not going to actually work because we're not binding our callback. We would need to be, say, we would want to bind our this to be a proper thing. So I think if we bound it to e.target, this would work properly. But in general, I don't like to rely on this when defining my functions, because a lot of times if you use an arrow function, as we can see up here, we're using arrow functions to get our different things, and the arrow function actually won't have this defined properly. So if we did we'll just do document dot add event listener, click. This is just going to be for example purposes. Now we have an arrow function, and we tried to call this. Now, if we inspect the page, go over to our console, you should expect this to be what we click on, but in reality, this is actually the global window object, and that's because we're using an arrow function. If this was a normal function, now this will behave how you expect it to be, but it's just going to be the thing that we're adding the event listener to. It's not actually the target. So you would need to rebind this function to the actual target you're selecting. So that's why in general, I don't like to use this. I would prefer to use e.target. I think it is just a little bit more self-explanatory as to exactly what you're selecting, as opposed to this, which could be ambiguous based on arrow functions or normal functions and so on. Someone's asking if you can have the source code for the project. The source code for the original version of this project is actually linked in the description of this live stream, as well as the video where we built everything for this entire project. I don't know if there's much need or want for the refactored version of the source code, especially because it's not going to be 100% finished. But if a lot of you do want the refactored version of this source code, I will try to push it up onto GitHub somewhere, maybe as a separate branch for this project, and I'll put it in the description of this video. If that's something you want, just make sure you let me know, and I can do that if you want that. Let's remove that here. We don't actually want this in our code. There we go. Okay, I see someone saying var versus let in loops. Definitely these should be let. There's no purpose to use var in a loop here. Purely, as I mentioned at the beginning of the live stream, I used var because it was for teaching beginners how to program and they're more familiar with the var keyword. But pretty much anywhere you see var, I would either use const or I would use let. And essentially if the variable changes, like in a for loop, I would use let. And if it doesn't change like this button, I would use const. And if we save that, you can see everything's going to work just as it did before. Okay, let's check to make sure there's nothing else. We can remove this commented out code. No point in having that stick around. Updating the cart total, let's see. Obviously I would change this to a for each as I mentioned, but there's really not much point in doing this. Actually, I may even change it to a reduce because as you can see, we're just calculating a total here. And if you remember from my reduce video, we could just take that array, we could say .reduce, and what we could do is we could have our, essentially our previous value, which is going to be here, which is our, whatever this would be, our element in the array, and then our current value, which would be, I'm sorry, this would be like our sum, and this would be our current element. So we could actually calculate our total, and then what we would do here is we would return this. So we'd say return total plus price times quantity. So we could actually put this entire loop inside of a reduce, and then the return of this reduce would be our total, just like that. So really either way works. Obviously this for loop is working, but you could do it in a reduce statement like this, or even a for each. It really is up to you what you find to be the most useful and easiest to read. That's one thing about code, is it's very subjective. It's a lot of times whatever you're most comfortable with is what you should be using. I see TC Thompson saying that he's really enjoying these live code reviews. I'm glad that you are. This is definitely something that's very new for me. I've done a couple code reviews on the channel, but they were all pre-recorded. I looked at the code, changed all the things in the code, pre-recorded everything, knew what I was going to say. And with this, I just jumped in. I had a general idea of what this project looked like, but I had no idea what I was going to change. So I'm really glad that you're enjoying it. That's great to hear. But looking through this, I don't really see too much left that I would change. Obviously, the const and the var and the let, I would change all those over, to let and const, but I don't want to change all of those inside this live stream. And same with these get elements by class name. I would use query selector or query selector all for these, obviously. I guess one other thing to note is that instead of using class names to select everything, I would actually use data attributes. So I would use, like a query selector all with a data attribute instead. So I'd be like data thing to select. And the reason for this is that if we're using our classes, I'm not sure if this class is used in the CSS or if it's used in the JavaScript or if it's used in both. So if I want to change this to be shop button, for example, like this, I don't know if I'm going to break my JavaScript or my CSS if I change that in my HTML as well. So that's one thing to note, is because if I look in my CSS and I search for shop item button, you can see, if I think that's what it's called, yeah, shop item button, you can see that it's not being used in the CSS, but it could be used in the CSS, or maybe it's used in a different CSS file that I don't actually see, or maybe it's from a library, like a Bootstrap library, and I don't have access to that in my repo, so I wouldn't even know that it's being used there. So if I wanted to change this, it's a risky thing because I don't know if I'm going to break something. And when you're breaking CSS or JavaScript, it can be really hard to see those changes, especially like a really small CSS change. Maybe it only works on media queries that are for mobile, so you never see it when you're testing. So this is why I always recommend using data attributes when you're selecting things in JavaScript, because then you don't clash with the classes that you use in your styles. Keeping those two things separate means I could change this to thing to select to, and I know I'm not going to break the style sheet or the CSS because I'm not using this data attribute in my style sheet. I'm using classes in my style sheet. I actually wrote about this in a newsletter article that came out a couple weeks ago, so this is something that I really advocate, and you'll notice in a lot of my newer videos, everything I do in JavaScript is data attributes, and everything I do in CSS is classes, and it just keeps those two things separate, so I don't have to worry about breaking one when I change the other one. Okay, so here's a great question. It says, hey Kyle, have you used Svelte before? I haven't used it really. I've looked at the documentation. I've gone through a bunch of the tutorials on the site. It actually has really good getting started tutorials. I really want to start diving into Svelte. That's something I want to start doing on this channel some more, but I really need to just figure it out more myself. Like I said, I haven't built anything with it yet. I've just gone through the tutorials and I really like what I see. It looks really cool. It seems a lot like a really simple version of React, almost kind of like a Vue meets React, like a combination of the two is how I view it. I really like it. Okay, so let me just double check. I don't think there's anything else I would change. I think I've pretty much covered anything that I would change. So I want to open it up to questions from you. Anything that you are curious about related to the JavaScript, the HTML, the CSS. We never really looked at the overall structure of the CSS, but in general, I think this is fairly well structured. As we can see, we have all of our nav stuff in one section, all of our container content section, all of our main stuff in one section, our footer, our buttons are all kind of grouped together. One thing you could do is use like parcel to break this out into multiple different CSS files and then compile it into one minified CSS file. But for this small of an application, this CSS is really not that big. It looks kind of big, but it's not that big overall. I don't really see much benefit to it. So keeping it like this, I think is perfectly fine. I see one question asking if I have a live stream schedule. I do not. This is the very first live stream I've done since my channel was like at 2,000 subscribers. I did one way back then with Eddie, who was at the beginning of this live stream. I don't know if he's still around, but I haven't really done one since then. It's not something I've got any consistency to. I want to potentially start incorporating more live streams into the channel. One thing I'm thinking about doing is maybe more code reviews like this, or taking like a large project. So a lot of my videos are projects that I build beforehand. I know exactly how to build it, and I'm kind of teaching you the process of building it. But an idea I've been playing around with is doing a live stream on a project I've not built before, maybe a larger project, and kind of learning with you how to go over the speed bumps, lots of bugs I'm going to run into, things I have to think through, debugging, kind of like a live coding of a project. I've thought about doing that in a live stream kind of format, maybe once a week, once every other week, something that fits into my schedule well. Right now my schedule is kind of chaotic, so it's hard to fit a consistency into it, but it is something that I've thought about doing. And I'm kind of interested to hear your feedback on if that's something that you would find interesting. Okay, I see a question about, okay, so someone's saying, what's the name of the combination of Vue and React? That is a library called Svelte. It's not directly a combination of the two, but it takes a lot of the easiness of Svelte, or of Vue, a lot of the magic of Vue, and I think it does that really well, but it also has a lot of the more, I don't know, it feels more JavaScript kind of like React does. It's not quite as magic as Vue is, in my opinion. So Svelte is that library. I'd look it up. It's a really cool new framework. I see someone asking if I covered unit tests in this example. I did not cover any unit test related stuff in this example. I think that this is actually a really good candidate for unit tests potentially. Inside of here, we have a lot of functions, such as the update functions, that could be really good for unit test. But this is such a small application where you can come in here and it'll take you very, very short amount of time to just test the code. Obviously, I broke something at some point. Let's just Control Z a little bit to see what I broke. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, it's really easy to test. I can test all of the functionality of the application in like 10 seconds, 15 seconds, maybe even 30. So unit tests for this application are, it's kind of hit or miss. It might take quite a while to write, and the amount of time you save may not be worth it. So it's really up to you whether you'd write unit tests for this or not. But for me, for such a short amount of JavaScript code, a couple hundred lines, I don't really think it's worth it. The test would probably be longer than the actual JavaScript code itself. Let's see, any other questions? So I see a question saying, I found myself reading others' code slower. How can I improve that? Does learning CS fundamentals help? I think when it comes to reading code, CS fundamentals are not going to be super useful because they're not used that often in code. It may help a little bit when it comes to certain things like short circuiting. So if you see like const variable is equal to like other, we could say like cart row or something else, like this kind of short circuiting where it defined cart row or this, having a little bit of an idea of CS fundamentals to know how this actually works, to say that it's going to assign to cart row, and if cart row is blank, it assigns to something. Knowing that might help. But in general, the way to read and learn code faster is just getting familiar with the project you're actually looking at. When you start a new project, it's incredibly difficult to read any code. I know every time I start a new project, I'm really slow reading through the code because every time you get to something, you're like, oh, what is that? I have to go look that up. Oh, what is this? I have to go look that up. And as you're doing that, you're looking more and more things up. Eventually, you'll just kind of get used to how that code is structured. A lot of times, a project is going to be structured very similarly. Like you know where all the root files are going to be inside of a server. You know where all the model files are going to be, all the view files. If it's a React application, you know where all the different hooks and components are going to lie. And once you figure that out, it's a lot easier to read through. You're going to start to learn the naming structure. So my advice would just be to not expect to know how to read the code right away and just try to figure out how the structure of the overall code is. Because once you figure out their like coding style and structure, it's a lot easier to guess what things do. And then you don't always have to look up everything and read it through word for word. You can say, okay, based on how other things work, I assume this is how this new thing works, and it makes it easier for you to read through code. Also, I see someone saying Svelte is a compiler. Yeah, this is the most important thing about Svelte is that React, Vue, Angular, all of these are client-side rendered. So when you push the code out, it's just empty HTML and a ton of JavaScript, but Svelte actually compiles the code down to JavaScript. So while you have React running, I'm sorry, I kind of said this wrong. Svelte is also client-side rendered, but it's using just plain vanilla JavaScript. So Svelte, you write your Svelte code, and then you build it, and it compiles to JavaScript. That is not anything to do with Svelte. It's just typical JavaScript that looks like this. You have elements by class name, that kind of stuff. But React actually runs React in the browser. So you had to push a lot more code. You had to push all the React code to the browser. But with Svelte, you only push the code you wrote, which gets compiled down to normal JavaScript. So it's much smaller of a bundle when you push it out to deploy. Let's see what else here. So I see a lot of people debating about whether Angular or React or Vue is going to be the most popular framework. I think in general, all of the frameworks are about equally chance of being popular. I think right now React is definitely the largest and the quickest growing, but 10 years from now, who knows what that's going to be? Maybe it's Svelte, maybe it's Vue. I think if you learn any of the major frameworks, Angular, React, Vue, you're going to be fine. You're going to have jobs for a long time to come. But if I were to put my money on one to learn, I'd probably just choose React based on the fact it's backed by Facebook and it's the largest right now. So it's the safest choice to go with, but you really can't go wrong with any of them, and it's easy to transfer between them once you know at least one. So someone's asking how I think about Vue in comparison to React. I've never really used Vue that much. I've looked at it and it looks interesting, a lot of the magic that kind of happens, the ease of binding between different things, and it intrigues me. It's something I want to learn, but I've just never really used it. I've been so into React and using React, I just haven't taken the time to learn Vue because it's kind of time consuming to do that, and I just haven't taken the time or seen the need right now. But it is something I want to cover more on the channel. I'm more interested in Svelte right now than Vue, just because Svelte looks like all the cool things that Vue has, but also that it's compiled, which is also cool. So right now I'm leaning towards learning Svelte over Vue, but that's just me personally. Let's see. When can I say that I know JavaScript? What do I have to know besides the basics? In my opinion, knowing a language is not so much about knowing all the syntax or all the things that it can do, but more so like how quickly can you create something with it. If I told you to create this shopping cart on the right here, would it take you a day, a week, a month? Like how long would it take you? And also, how much research would you have to do in the process? For me, I'm at the point where I can create this for the most part without having to do much Googling to figure things out. I may have to do a little bit of Googling for, maybe the syntax of specific things such as this e.target.matches. I didn't know if it was match or matches. I could have to Google that, but for the most part, if you can create something without a huge amount of Googling, then you generally can say that you know it pretty well, like quite well. And if you have to do a little bit of Googling here and there just for syntax related things, I still think you know it really well. But if you get to the point where you just don't know enough syntax to almost even know what to Google, that's when you don't quite know it very well. So a lot of times it's hard to know what to search for when you're first getting started with a language because you just don't know the language at all. So that's the point where I'd say that you're more in the beginner stages. And as you start to not need Google as much and you can start to build things quickly, like if I told you, oh, I wanted this button to add something to the cart, if immediately your mind starts going to, okay, I need to add an event listener, and that event listener needs to create some HTML elements, and then they need to append it to, the cart section. If your mind already thinks through what needs to be done and how it can be done, then I'd say that you're fairly proficient in the language already, and that's pretty much the hardest part. Actually knowing the exact syntax of how to do things is not as important, but knowing the process of how to get somewhere is what's really important, which is why I think it's not so much about knowing a programming language as much as it is about knowing how to program, because every programming language allows you to do almost the exact same things, but just in different ways. So just knowing how to do things, for example, adding event listeners, how I actually deal with on-click events, that kind of stuff is what's important, and knowing just how programming languages work, that problem-solving skill is what's most important, because even though I've never used, for example, another language, like I don't use C very much, I could move over to C and I could know how to do something. I would just need to do a lot of research on exactly how to do everything syntax-wise, because I just don't use C. I haven't used it since college, so that's kind of the difference. But my programming knowledge is enough that I think I could transfer it over to C fairly easily. Obviously, C is quite a bit different than JavaScript, but you know what I mean. Like the programming knowledge is the most important part, and language skills are much lesser in my opinion. You'll kind of learn those as you go, and a lot of people, when they review your code, will give you tips on better ways to do things. For example, if you used a bunch of vars everywhere, someone would review your code and tell you, hey, you should probably use let or const. It's a better, thing to do nowadays. Let's see. So a lot of people are asking what framework they should learn first. I would say React is probably the easiest to learn first in my opinion. I prefer React, and I think it's the most JavaScript-like of all the frameworks. Vue and Angular have a lot of behind-the-scenes magic that they do things for you, and React is just JavaScript. There's still quite a bit of React-specific magic going on, but it's a little bit more JavaScript-focused in my opinion, so I would say React is probably going to be the best one to learn first. I also have a lot more videos on React. I have a course on React. I have a bunch more React content on my channel, so if you enjoy my teaching, you can use a lot of my content to help you with that learning process. Best place to start for full stack web development to learn. I have a full stack Node.js playlist on my channel, which is like 6 hours of video, I think, that walk you through the process of, it's mostly the backend related portion of full stack. So I have this playlist, which is the introduction to web development, where I create this project here, you can see. And then after that, there's the full stack portion of it, where it's a completely different project focused mostly on Node, Express, MongoDB, that kind of stuff. I'd recommend starting there. That's going to give you a good starting point for the backend related technology. And then from there, just build your own project. For me, when I was learning, I would watch a bunch of YouTube videos to get the basic ideas, and then I just went and built something. I was like, you know what? I want to build this cool thing. I'm going to build it. And I would build it, and I'd get stuck, and I'd Google how to do it, and I would fix it, and then I get stuck again, and just back and forth, constantly getting stuck and unstuck is how I learned pretty much everything I know about web development. Oops, sorry for that loud noise. It looks like a lot of people have positive thoughts about the live coding, so that's definitely something that I'm going to try to think about and try to incorporate in the future. It's something that I think that would bring a lot of value, because the thought process, I think, is the hardest part to portray in programming, and doing it live is, you can obviously see my thought process. It's kind of probably a pain for you to have to sit through all of the mistakes, but I think sitting through that mistake also, brings about a lot of my thought process and how I problem solve things, which is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important skills to programming. Let's see what else. Okay, I see someone asking about WebSockets. I think WebSockets are a great solution if you want to do real-time communication between the browser and the client, or between the client and the server. For example, a real-time chat application, I used WebSockets for that. But if you're just updating things between the browser and the client, like forum submissions and that kind of stuff, I don't think WebSockets are a great solution. It's probably just better to do normal server, HTTP, post, GET, that kind of stuff, just because it doesn't need to be real time. But when you have that real time, like you need to update the client when things change on the server, then WebSockets are best for you. So if, for example, you have a Trello board, if you've ever used Trello, and someone drags something from one column to another column, then you maybe want to update all the other clients saying that that thing has been moved from where it was before, and WebSockets are great for that. Okay, any last questions? I guess I'm starting to get to the point where I'm going to wrap this up, just a couple more minutes, so I'll just answer a couple more questions before the very end of this. See if anything comes in. It's unfortunately quite a large delay on YouTube. I'm not sure whether I have something configured incorrectly on my end or not, but I need to do some looking into that because there's quite the delay on my end between your end. It's like a 30-second delay or so, which is unfortunate. Someone's asking if I do any mentoring. I don't do any mentoring. I figure that I have a limited amount of time and I'd rather spend that time making a video or a live stream where I can reach hundreds or thousands of people instead of spending that time one-on-one teaching someone. Because most of the time what I'm going to teach one-on-one is something that I could also teach to hundreds or thousands of people. And then I'm going to be able to reach more people by making a video on a topic rather than one-on-one mentoring. I really enjoy one-on-one teaching and I wish I could do more of it. I just don't really have the time to do it, unfortunately. It's very time consuming and I barely have enough time as is to make all the videos that I make. I see someone asking about getting live data from a database. Would WebSockets be helpful in that? WebSockets are helpful in the way that you want to update the client when changes are made. So if, for example, your database has lots of changes happening to it, you could use WebSockets. So for example, let's say your database gets updated when information gets posted to your API. Inside your API, you could have some kind of handler that uses WebSockets to send those updated information down to the client. That'd be a great use case for it. But really, you only want to deal with WebSockets when your client information needs to know about the updates. If, for example, it's something that's not important to be told to the client, like in our case, this cart example, it doesn't matter if the other clients know what's in your shopping cart. Like let's say we posted these information to a client or to the server. It doesn't matter if someone else knows about what's in your shopping cart. So it doesn't matter to be posting with WebSockets. But in like a chat application, it's really important that you know what other people said. Let's see what else. So I see someone asking about Flutter. I've never used Flutter, so I unfortunately don't really have any feedback on it. I've really not even looked into it, so I don't really know about Flutter too much. I think if you don't like Bootstrap, I see a question about Bootstrap saying, should you use it or your own SaaS? If you don't like Bootstrap, don't use it. I don't use Bootstrap unless I absolutely have to. Like if a client I'm working with uses Bootstrap, then I'll use it, but I prefer not to use Bootstrap. And you can see in all of my YouTube videos, I've never used Bootstrap in any of them. I prefer to write my own CSS. It's more fun that way, in my opinion. So if you want to write your own, go right ahead. I think it's better for learning anyway. Okay, so I see this is going to be my last answer here for a question. It's saying that WebSockets are only for all users as opposed to one single user. And the way you set up your WebSockets is it can post to one user, many users, a small subset of users. It's entirely up to how you define the WebSockets, who it gets posted to. So that is something that is based on how you actually define the things, whether or not the WebSockets are going to get posted there or not. So that's entirely up to you. And unfortunately, I can't get to all the rest of these questions. I just don't have the time. This has already gone later than I had expected. So with this, I'm going to say goodbye. And thank you all so much to everyone that's joined. There's so many more people here than I expected for the live stream, and I'm so glad you guys are all enjoying it. I am going to look into doing more of these live streams in the future, maybe some live coding live streams or some more code review live streams. Let me know what you want, maybe down in the comments of this video, send me a message, whatever it is. I'd be interested in hearing your feedback on what you would like in the future. So with all of that, thank you all very much for watching this video, and I really hope you have a great day.